Following the success of Donkey Kong Country, Rareware were going to create a sequel a year later, well known as Donkey Kong Country 2, being the 6th best-selling SNES game on the console. It's no surprise that, just like Donkey Kong Country 1, the second game would receive a port as well. Unlike the first game though, there was only the one port made for the Game Boy Advance, which thankfully makes my job a little easier. The port of the first game focused on standardizing the gameplay experience to be more like its sequel games, Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3. Obviously, this isn't necessary for this game, meaning that the levels are much more faithful to the original game, with some exceptions here and there. After the publisher and developers are shown at the game's start, we get a nice splash screen which is heavily based on the box art for Donkey Kong Land 2, funnily enough. The Japanese version is instead, for whatever reason, just based on a random piece of artwork where they're in a swamp. Not sure why they changed it and why it's just a random piece of artwork, but whatever. The main menu starts you off with 3 options: Start, Diddy's Dash, and Bonus Games. Bonus Games brings you into a menu where you can play Expresso's Racing, Funky's Flights, and Bag a Bug, either by yourself or with a friend. These are the 3 new minigames that this game has implemented, similar to the dancing and fishing that the first game's port had. The first mode, Expresso's Racing, is surprisingly well integrated into the game thanks to the Golden Feather item, which is basically that there's a new item to find in every single level in the game. Every feather you find lets you power Expresso up by increasing one of his stats. Strength makes it easier to push other racers, speed makes you faster, and Flight and Boost lets you hold 1 extra Flight and Boost item per level. Thus, finding more feathers makes the racing game easier. The racing itself is fairly straightforward. You run down a narrow path, avoiding hazards like puddles that slow you down, and hitting zippers that speed you up. You also can collect those feather and boost items to use when you need them. A bit off topic here for a second, what the heck are those boost items anyways? They've always just looked like a pile of dirt to me. I think they're supposed to be seeds, but I mean, if you look at the wikis for this game, even they just say boost. Call it a boost item, like, what the heck? It's just gold dirt. Overall, even though the controls and hitboxes aren't perfect, the racing is actually decently enjoyable. Every level you beat during single player gets you a DK coin too. The next mode is Funky's Flights, and here's where the real meat and potatoes of the minigames is. In Funky's Flights, you control a helicopter with a basic single-shot weapon, complete various objectives based on your mission. For example, in one level, you fly around and rescue Kongs in a Hornet Hive. And in another, you carry a chest through an underwater level with limited oxygen. The final level has you race through a castle level with, that instant death toxic waste that we all know and love, rising up and down. There's several items you can pick up from range from health pickups to time extensions to actual other weapon pickups as well. The controls feel pretty natural to how a helicopter would handle. The objectives are varied and just overall the game's really fun to play actually. Every level you beat here also gets you DK coin just like the racing. It's a surprisingly good minigame all things considered. The final mode is Bag a Bug. This game, unlike the others, is pretty basic and kinda boring to be honest. The game is, you run around a small circular arena avoiding Clubba, picking up randomly generated fireflies and invincibility powers. You can only pick up fireflies when they stop moving, and there's only a single map to play on. Plus, Clubba is really easy to avoid. You just hide in one of the 4 corners of the map basically. So, most of the time the game pretty much just dissolves into running from one alcove to the next. There's no DK coins to get thankfully, so you don't even have to do it. Like, this game feels like such a throwaway because it's, compared to the others, there's just the one thing. There's pretty much no reason to play it because lives don't matter in this port, just like all the mobile ports, so there's virtually, it costs, I don't remember how many coins it costs, but it costs coins and then you get lives from beating it, and it's, why would you ever do it? Lives don't matter. Anyways, the other option you can pick on the main menu is Diddy's Dash, which is basically sort of like the score attack from the first game's port, but instead of a score, the focus is on completing levels as fast as possible. Except when using a certain cheat code, you, as the name implies, plays Diddy solo, racing through levels that are mostly identical. The main difference is that checkpoints are more plentiful basically. Instead of just the one checkpoint in the middle of the level, you've actually got several checkpoints in order to basically compensate for the fact that it's really easy to die because you're just one player. But keep in mind that time keeps going even if you die, so you can complete the levels in the time attack pretty easily, but if you want a good time, you can't die. Some loading zones are removed as well to speed up pointless rooms like the animal transformation rooms. And any sort of bonus rooms or barrels just warp you to where they exit you from. The big gimmick of this mode is that comboing into multiple enemies by jumping on them, rolling into them, or charging through them with Rambi or Endguard will freeze the timer, starting at 2 seconds for every 2 enemy KOs. This lends itself into making level runs a lot more strategic, with the best times making the best use of groups of enemies to get massive time freeze multipliers. Overall, because of the more focused gameplay of Diddy's Dash, it's just a lot more play compared to the score attack, which, if we all remember that, score attack is really easy to cheese because, in fact, as I found out, there's actually exploits where you can get infinite time, essentially. You can get an infinite score, because you can go through a room, get a clock, exit, go back in, and get more time, and it just goes forever. So levels like that are just completely broken. Anyways, finally, we just have, the standard file select, which is pretty much exactly the same as the original game in terms of function. The cheat menu is actually just among your options menu instead of being in a weird, secluded, new file select weird spot. So, in other words, you can actually enter cheat codes on existing files instead of just on new games. And it's actually got a full range of letters to enter too, instead of just button combos. You can also enter a cheat to access the sound test instead of pressing down on the new file just like the original. Speaking of which, as I hinted at earlier, if you enter the cheat code Wellard or Rockard, which both remove DK rails in the game, these will force the game to always start with Diddy and Dixie, just like the hard modes in the original games. And funnily enough, this actually applies to the main menu and to the Diddy's Dash mode too, which actually lets you play through Diddy's Dash with both Diddy and Dixie, which, not surprisingly, is pretty glitchy, but it's actually pretty cool to do. There's even some weird interactions where normally it shows Diddy's face alongside the timer, but if you start the level as Dixie, it'll actually show her face, which it's weird. That's all I'm gonna say about it. I'm not gonna bother trying to explain that because I have no clue. Just like in the original game's GBA port, starting a new file will give you a nice little abridged version of the story that was in the manual for the original game. Starting off on the world map, one strange decision that makes itself apparent pretty quickly is that for some reason the world map is mirrored. Not sure why. You start off on the right and climb up the left side of the island instead of starting off on the left and climbing up on the right side of the island. Why? I don't know. It's just a change they made. Once again, just like the original game's ports, the maps are completely redesigned to be more like an actual physical map to traverse, compared to the original game's static background images. And just like the first game's port, that means that while it actually looks a little more interesting to actually move around the map, it also means that it takes longer to actually move around, and the zoomed in camera makes it kind of tough to grasp where exactly you are, relatively, which is, your classic case of they've gone for form over function, which isn't bad, but it does kind of hurt replay value just a little bit. One minor but nice detail is that when you unlock levels in the Lost World, you can access that level from any entrance from then on then, instead of only having access to that level from the original club spot, which is a nice quality of life change because it means you don't have to constantly backtrack out of worlds just to access different levels in, Lost World. You can just all play them all at once. The level order compared to the first Game Boy Advance port is nearly identical to the original game, other than the placement of the Kong family spots being rearranged. The only big set of changes takes place in K.Rool's Keep. Castle Crush is now the second level, Clapper's Cavern is the third, and Windy Well is the fourth. Essentially, Windy Well got moved 2 levels further into the world, and the other 2 levels just moved down 1 spot. Speaking of the Kong family, they serve pretty much the same purpose as the original game. Cranky has the pay for hints, along with the option to play the racing game. Wrinkly doesn't save your game anymore as that's handled on the world map. Instead, still having to pay for tutorials and a returning feature in the form of the scrapbook. The scrapbook is more or less the same as the first game. You get pictures from doing various things like KOing enemies, defeating bosses, finding them in secret spots, and so forth. You get a DK coin for every single page you fill in, and you can also even pay, which is a nice feature to have Wrinkly tell you where you can find certain pictures, which will help you if you're getting stuck on things, since there's otherwise no indication of where you can find them. Funky lets you play its flying game and lets you access the map flying freely from the world map menu. Swanky is actually identical in terms of his quizzes. The game itself is flashier in terms of graphics, but it's exactly the same. Other than minor things like the questions I ask you what buttons handle which features, like running isn't Y anymore, it's B. So that's changed. Finally, Clubba is also the same, plus you can play Bag-a-Bug. One minor detail about Wrinkly's area actually is that the background outside the windows actually changes now based on which world you're in. Which is, you know, it's not necessary, but it's a cool little touch. Finally, as I've mentioned, you have access to a menu while in the overworld. From this menu, you can access various things, including all the tips you've gotten from Wrinkly and Cranky. You can access the stats, the levels you've played, and your minigame scores. You can save and quit the game, and you can leave the map you're on with the gyrocopter. And you can look at the scrapbook pictures. The overall look of the game is as is the theme of this port, much closer to the original game, with only little minor additions like there's small insects in the ground and stuff. Once again, just like the first game's port, in order to accommodate the hardware of the original Game Boy Advance, the saturation and brightness of the game was significantly increased, which results in, sadly, fairly ugly looking colors when you play it on an SP. Toxic Tower notably has really bright green castle tiles and even brighter green toxic waves, which without the backlight it's fine, but when you have a backlight on an SP it just looks horrible. In fact, ironically, Glimmer, the fish that, lights up the way, isn't even needed in the one level he shows up in, because the level is already pretty bright. Some level archetypes aren't as bad though, like the roller coaster levels are set at sunset instead of at night, which actually looks pretty nice. It's nice that sometimes they accounted for this. I'm not sure why they got lazy with other things. Unlike the first game's port, enemies use pretty much the same color palettes as the original game. There's a couple extra additions, like Float Sands and Flitters have more colors than the original, but the original colors still exist, so. The credits in this port dynamically change locations based on which section of the credits you're in, instead of just being in Clubba's spot the whole time. So for example, when you're looking at the Gremlins, it's in a swamp, and when you're looking at the Animal Buddies, they're in the ice area. Which is, once again, nice touch, not necessary, but it does lend to creativity a bit more. The layouts of the levels themselves are also pretty much the same as the original game, with some minor bits of extra content added to house the new feather item to find on every level. But most of the time the feather is just put in a spot that already existed, but only had temporary rewards like banana coins, or was just otherwise empty space. The one major change is that the midpoint in Animal Antics was actually moved from the start of the Squitter section to the start of the Squawk section, likely because of how infamously difficult that part of the game is. There's a couple of odd oversights, if you even want to call them that, because to be honest, I'm not sure if they are at all, or if it's just something they changed for no reason, but basically there's a couple cases of pass-through walls where they were either changed or just forgotten how they originally existed. For example, in the very first underwater level, Lockjaw's Locker, the secret tunnel just before the water rises can't be accessed from that spot anymore, which means that there's a Flotsam enemy that's just hanging out down there that normally hints at that location, but now he's just completely pointless because there's no reason to go in the water. And what's strange about this is that the wall on the end still is passed through, so you can, all the stuff is still there, you just can't access it from the start, so you just have to go from the back, get to the front, and then backtrack again. It's bizarre. It just means you have to backtrack through an empty tunnel, and you can't use it as a shortcut, which is strange to me. There's a couple other ones I found in the start of Glimmer's Galleon, too. So, the secret coin near the start can be passed through from the top of the wall as well as the side, which makes it really easy to just find by accident, because if you're not swimming, you'll just kind of drop to the floor. There's another one, too, a little later into the level. Right above the second DK bell, that set of tunnels up above, those tunnels are reversed. So instead of entering from the top and going down, you go from the bottom and go to the top, which actually makes it more useful as a shortcut. But then that begs the question, why change this one? Why is they changing this one to be more useful, but then in an earlier level, they make it less useful as a shortcut? What's the thought process? It's just random changes. There's probably other things they didn't find as well, but that's all I could find at the moment. Otherwise, most stuff is pretty much the same. Bosses, unlike the port in the first game, are virtually identical. Crow alternates between the left and the right side, so dropping eggs, instead of just being always on the right, which is actually probably the biggest difference among all the returning bosses. Cleaver is pretty much exactly the same, just slightly different timing differences. Cudgel can be hit in the air, which wasn't possible in the original, which actually leads to a fairly serious error where if you defeat him while he's in the air, when he falls into the background, he won't actually end properly. He gets kind of stuck in the swamp, and the fight will never end. And after a couple seconds, the sound will actually start to glitch out significantly, resulting in a loud mid-pitched screech that plays very loudly. So, try not to do that. King Zing is, just like Cleaver, pretty much the same, just, minor differences in timing. Creepy Crow as well, and even the first K.Rool fight is almost exactly the same. The secret boss does have one notable difference. The warning shots he fires, instead of being reverse shots, are actually freeze shots. And it just so happens that in this version of the game, breaking out of the ice is actually really difficult because I guess likely because you have less buttons to press, so you can't break out as easily. So it results in the final boss actually being a little more difficult than the original game. By far the biggest difference among the bosses is the introduction of a completely new boss that takes the place of Stronghold Showdown from the original game. K.Rool, as the name implies, fights by blasting the arena with streams of fire. It's decently challenging and kind of enjoyable. It's a little, it's hard to say. I guess uninspired is the word I would use. It's fun, but it's not like, not breaking any new ground. Replaying boss fights is actually different in this version now. When you enter a boss fight again, Swanky shows up and will ask you for 10 coins to replay them. During these rematches, you get timed, and if you beat the time, you get 6 lives. Personally, I don't like having to pay to replay content, but having a time trial for bosses is a nice feature. But then you have to ask, why isn't the bosses just in the time trial mode? It's just weirdly inconsistent that they put it in the normal game. Because they have, Diddy's Dash, it's a time trial mode. But whatever. I haven't mentioned this yet, but once again, like the GBA port of Donkey Kong Country 1, all the sound effects are different, with more sound effects being added in spots and places where they didn't happen before, and existing sounds being changed to other ones. Just so happens that most of these sounds come from either Donkey Kong 64 or Diddy Kong Racing, and even a couple come from GoldenEye of all things. The music in this port is one of the low points. Unlike previous ports, the music here is pretty much the same songs as the original game, but with just lower quality instruments and sound. This is kinda sad given that the 8-bit Donkey Kong Color and even the Donkey Kong GBA 1 both compensated for their shortcomings in sound hardware with unique arrangements, while this game just has nothing. It's just the same music but lower quality. It's quite a shame given that, Donkey Kong Country 2's soundtrack is practically legendary. Even the few new music tracks they added for minigame stuff is painfully average. It's not bad, but it's disappointing. That's the best way to put it. There's a few new cutscenes that play too after beating K.Rool the first and second time. Notably, the scene that plays after the second secret fight is actually based on how many DK coins you have. The original one will play normally, but if you have all 68 DK coins, then it actually plays a new cutscene that shows him getting bombed. Because, that's fun. Finally, let's talk about how the game feels and controls. The returning animal buddies, Rambi and Ingard, control pretty much exactly the same as they did in the original game's port, other than the obvious addition of the supercharge they both have. Though, for some reason, Rambi's supercharge is really slow in this version. He just runs at normal running speed, whereas in the original game, he runs really fast. And this is especially strange because Ingard still moves about as fast as he does normally. So it's like Ingard's fast, but Rambi, they just made him really slow for some reason. Speaking of which, Rambi still has this weird momentum issue, which makes it kind of hard to stop with him, especially when you're in the air. Now we've got 3 new animal buddies to talk about. Squitter controls surprisingly well, similar to his original incarnation, other than, the standard stronger momentum that remains true in this port. Squawks isn't nearly as responsive and agile as he is in the original game, but he's still pretty good. He's nice and responsive. He's just a little sluggish at times. Ratley's actually the most changed, being very similar to how they applied changes to Winky in the original game. His standard movement is pretty much exactly the same as Winky, in fact, down to the fact that moving with the D-pad no longer counts as jumping, so you can't move into enemies to kill them anymore. And because of this, you can't gain as much height by jumping mid-hop, because he doesn't jump as high, because he basically moves normally on the ground instead of having to do little mini hops everywhere. Because of this, you have to rely on the super jump a little more often in order to reach some platforms. So basically, Ratley's easier to control, but personally I find it a little less fun to hop around as him. But to be honest, it's just my opinion. The Kongs themselves actually control pretty much exactly as they do in the first game's port. It's been refined a little bit, so stopping and starting to move isn't nearly as awkward as it used to be. Overall, this game's port is a lot better than the previous one, and though it does have its fair share of negatives, it's still a pretty good adaptation, with its own share of unique attributes that give it a nice place to stand among the behemoth that it attempts to replicate.